If you take one more step, they will throw you out, someone whispered. But Clara Whitmore had already crossed the threshold, and the ballroom swallowed her whole. A flood of gold light, and silk and music that faltered just enough to be noticed as the doors struck the marble behind her, not loudly, but with a weight that did not belong to a servant's entrance. And for a moment she stood there, breathing too fast, one hand still pressed to the door, as if she might turn and run back into the night she had just escaped. But she did not, because the room had already seen her, and in a place like this, being seen was the same as being judged, and the judgment came quickly. It always did, in the flick of a fan, in the tilt of a chin, in the way a conversation stopped without needing to say why. And Clara felt it move across her like cold air, measured, precise, dismissive, her dress too plain, the fabric worn thin at the cuffs, the hem uneven where it had caught on stone somewhere. Outside, her gloves mismatched, one slightly looser than the other, and her hair pinned in a way that suggested effort but not refinement, as though she had done it herself without a mirror that mattered. And she knew exactly what they saw when they looked at her, not a guest, not even a curiosity, but a mistake that had slipped through the edges of a system built to keep people like her out. And still she moved forward, because stopping would have made it worse. Stopping would have turned her into something pitted, and she could not afford pity tonight, not with the letter pressed between her fingers, the paper slightly bent from how tightly she had held it through the wind and the dark and the long stretch of gravel leading up to the estate. And she took one step, then another, careful, measured, as if she belonged just enough to avoid being removed immediately, though every instinct told her she did not. And near the center of the room, a group of young women stood in a loose formation, their gowns catching the chandelier light in soft waves of ivory and pale blue and silver, each one positioned with intention, each one aware of where she stood and who might be watching, their smiles practiced, their posture perfect, and Clara did not look at them directly. But she felt the contrast like a line drawn across the floor, one side polished and expected, the other uncertain and out of place. And somewhere to her right, a woman reached out, fingers closing around Clara's wrist with a firmness that was almost polite. Almost. "You are not meant to be here," she said, her voice low enough to avoid a scene, but sharp enough to carry, and Clara's hand tightened instinctively around the letter, the edges pressing into her palm. "I just need a moment," she replied, quieter still, because volume would have made this something else, something worse. And the woman's grip shifted, not loosening, not yet, but adjusting, as though deciding whether to remove her now or wait for someone of higher authority to notice and do it instead. And for a second, everything seemed to pause, not completely, not enough to draw attention, but enough that Clara became aware of the small details, the sound of a glass being set down somewhere behind her, the faint rustle of silk as someone turned, the distant echo of footsteps from above, and then, without meaning to, she looked up, just slightly, just enough to catch the movement at the top of the grand staircase, where a figure had appeared without announcement, tall, still, one hand resting against the banister as if he had always been there, and the room had only just caught up to his presence. And, even before anyone spoke his name, the space changed, not louder, not quieter, but tighter, as though every person in it had suddenly remembered where they stood in relation to him. And Clara did not know why her breath slowed in that moment, only that it did, and that the hand on her wrist loosened just enough for her to feel it, just enough for the letter to slip slightly in her grasp, the paper shifting, threatening to fall. And somewhere above, the Duke had not yet moved, not exactly, but he was looking, not at the line of women waiting beneath the chandeliers, not at the hosts or the carefully arranged guests, but somewhere else, somewhere lower, somewhere closer to the place where Clara Whitmore stood, as if she had never been meant to stand there at all. And for the briefest second, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, though no one would have admitted it. And then the letter slipped from her fingers and began to fall. The letter did not fall quickly, not the way things fall when they are unimportant. It slipped instead, catching the light as it tilted, a single sheet of cream paper marked with a seal that had already begun to crack from the pressure of Clara's grip. And for a moment she reached for it, fingers moving too late, brushing air where it had been, and the woman beside her tightened her hold again, sharper now, as if the mistake had confirmed something she had already decided. "Enough," she said, under her breath, pulling Clara half a step back toward the edge of the room, toward the doors that had not yet fully settled from her entrance. But the letter continued its slow descent, turning once, then again, before landing on the polished marble with a sound so soft it should not have been heard at all. And yet it was, or perhaps it was not the sound but the attention that followed it, because several heads turned at once, drawn not by the object itself, but by the disruption it represented. And Clara felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, the way a room recalibrates when something refuses to remain invisible, and she moved again, this time more carefully, angling her body just enough to free her wrist from the woman's grasp, not by force but by timing, a slight turn, a release that looked almost like compliance, and then she stepped forward, one foot, then the other, lowering herself toward the floor as if she were simply correcting a small oversight, as if this were a space where she had the right to bend, to reach, to retrieve what was hers. But before her fingers could close around the edge of the paper, a heel came down, deliberate, precise, the edge of a satin shoe pinning the letter in place, and Clara stopped, not because she chose to but because there was nowhere else to go, her hand hovering inches above the marble, suspended between intention and refusal, and she lifted her gaze slowly, following the line of the shoe, upward to the woman who wore it, one of the young ladies from the center of the room, her gown a pale silver that caught the light with every slight movement, her expression composed, almost pleasant, but not kind, not quite. "You dropped something," the lady said, though the statement held no offer within it, only a quiet assertion of control, and Clara straightened, just enough to meet her eyes, just enough to be seen as something more than a shadow at the edge of the floor. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady in a way she did not feel. "I did." And for a second, neither of them moved. The letter between them, claimed and unclaimed at once, and around them the room resumed its motion in fragments, a fan opening, a glass lifted, a whisper carried from one shoulder to another, but the center of it, this small, contained moment, remained suspended, as if waiting for a decision that had not yet been made. And above, on the staircase, the Duke had begun to move, not abruptly, not with any show of urgency, but with a certainty that altered the pace of everything below. One step, then another, the sound of his shoes against the stone measured and unhurried, each one landing with a weight that did not need to be announced, and those nearest the base of the stairs shifted instinctively, creating space without being asked, their bodies adjusting to accommodate a presence that did not negotiate its path. And still he did not look at the line of women arranged for him, did not acknowledge the careful positioning, the silent expectations, the futures that had been prepared in advance of his arrival. His gaze fixed instead on a point that had not been part of the evening's design, and Clara felt it before she fully understood it, the way attention can be felt like a change in temperature, a quiet narrowing of the world around you. And she lowered her eyes again, not in submission but in calculation, because to look too directly would have been to invite something she could not yet define. And the lady in silver shifted her weight slightly, the pressure of her heel increasing just enough to crease the edge of the paper beneath it, a small, controlled movement that said more than any raised voice could have, and Clara saw it, saw the intention in it, the quiet insistence that this was not her place, that whatever she had carried into this room would not be allowed to pass freely through it. And for a moment, just a moment, she considered stepping back, leaving it there, letting the letter remain under someone else's control, because that would have been easier. That would have ended this before it could become something else. But then the Duke reached the final step, and the room shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that tightened every breath. And without lifting her head fully, Clara moved her hand forward the last inch, not to take the letter yet, not to challenge the claim placed over it, but simply to rest her fingers against the marble beside it. A small, deliberate act that said she had not stepped back, that she had not left, and for the briefest second, everything held there, the heel, the hand, the paper between them, and the sound of the Duke's next step closing the distance. The sound of that final step did not echo, it settled, low and controlled, as Duke Alexander Hawthorne reached the marble floor and did not stop, not to greet, not to acknowledge, not even to glance toward the line of women who had been arranged for him with such careful precision, and the effect was immediate, subtle but absolute. Conversations thinned, laughter dissolved before it could fully form, and the space in front of him opened as though guided by an invisible hand, because no one wished to be in the path of a man who never altered his course, and still he walked, straight, deliberate, each movement exact, his gaze fixed forward with a focus that made everything else seem incidental, and Clara felt it again, that narrowing, that quiet shift in the air that told her she had become the center of something she did not understand, and she did not move, not yet, her fingers still resting against the marble beside the letter, her posture caught between rising and remaining. Because to stand too quickly would have drawn attention, and to stay lowered would have suggested submission, and neither felt safe, and beside her the lady in silver held her position, her heels still pressing lightly against the paper, though the pressure had changed, not stronger, not weaker, but more aware, as if she had realized that this small act now existed within a larger moment, one that no longer belonged entirely to her. And the Duke did not slow as he approached, but something in the room slowed for him, a breath held too long, a glance that lingered a second past propriety, and when he reached them, he stopped, not abruptly, not with any sign of interruption, but with the same measured control that had brought him there. And for a heartbeat, nothing happened, no one spoke, no one shifted. And then he looked down, not at the lady who had claimed the letter, not at the hand resting inches from it, but at the space between them, as though the significance of the moment lay not in either person alone, but in the tension that held them both in place. And Clara felt the weight of that gaze without meeting it, felt it in the stillness of her own breath, in the slight tightening of her fingers against the stone, and she knew, with a clarity that arrived too quickly to question, that whatever happened next would not be undone, and the lady in silver spoke first, because someone always did when silence stretched too long. "Your Grace," she said, her tone smooth, practiced, the kind that carried respect without yielding control. "It seems there has been a small disruption," and she shifted her foot just slightly, enough to reveal the edge of the letter beneath it, enough to make the situation visible without relinquishing her claim. And the Duke did not respond, not immediately, his attention still fixed on that narrow space where paper met marble, where hand met hesitation, and then, without a word, he moved, a small motion, almost unnoticeable if not for the way the entire room reacted to it. He stepped closer, closing the distance that had separated observer from participant, and Clara's hand lifted. Instinctively, not retreating, not advancing, but adjusting, creating just enough space for what might come next, and the lady in silver hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, her composure holding but her certainty shifting, and in that fraction, the balance changed, not dramatically, not visibly to all, but enough, and the Duke bent, not fully, not in any way that diminished him, but with a controlled precision that brought him level with the object on the floor, and his hand moved, gloved fingers reaching toward the letter with a calm that did not ask permission, and for the first time, the lady lifted her foot, not quickly, not as a retreat, but as an adjustment that came too late to matter. And the letter was no longer under her control, and Clara watched it happen without moving, without interfering, because this was no longer hers to take. And when the Duke straightened, the paper held between his fingers, the room seemed to exhale in a way that was almost silent, almost imperceptible, and still he did not look at the assembled guests, did not acknowledge the shift he had created, his attention turning instead, slowly, deliberately, toward Clara, and this time, she did not look away, not because she felt equal, but because something in the moment demanded it, and for a second that stretched longer than it should have, they held that line, his gaze steady, unreadable, hers uncertain but unbroken, and then he spoke, his voice low, even, carrying without effort, "Is this yours?" And the question was simple, almost ordinary, but nothing about it felt that way, not with the entire ballroom waiting on the answer, not with the letter in his hand, not with the space around them drawn tight with expectation, and Clara felt her breath return in a measured way, felt her fingers uncurl from the marble as she rose, slowly, carefully, not rushing, not faltering, until she stood facing him fully, the difference in height, in presence, in everything unmistakable, and still she said, "Yes, Your Grace," her voice steady enough to hold, and the Duke regarded her for a moment longer, not evaluating, not dismissing, but considering, as if confirming something only he could see. And then, instead of handing the letter back, he kept it, his hand lowering slightly. The paper still held between his fingers, and the smallest shift rippled through the room. Confusion, curiosity. Something sharper beneath it, and Clara felt it, felt the change in how she was being seen. No longer invisible, not yet accepted, but something else, something unsettled, and the Duke turned his head slightly, just enough for his voice to carry beyond her. "Clear this space," he said, and the command was quiet, but it moved through the room like a current, immediate, undeniable, and people stepped back, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a series of small adjustments that created distance, that carved out a circle where none had existed before. And when he looked back at Clara, the letter still in his hand, the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was waiting. The space around them did not empty all at once. It shifted in layers, a step back here, a turned shoulder there, until what had been a crowded center of silk and expectation became a cleared circle of polished marble. And Clara felt the distance open around her like a boundary she had not been invited to cross, but now could not leave. And still the Duke did not move to return the letter. His hand relaxed at his side. The paper held with a casual certainty that made it seem less like an object, and more like a decision already made. And across the room, the murmurs began, quiet at first, contained behind fans and gloved hands, but gathering, threading through the music that had not resumed, because no one had signaled for it to resume. And without that signal, even the orchestra seemed uncertain, bows hovering just above strings, waiting for permission that had not yet been given. And Clara stood within that pause, aware of every small detail, the faint scent of wax and polished wood, the distant clink of glass against glass that did not quite belong to this moment, the weight of her own breath as she steadied it. And then a voice cut through the quiet, clear, controlled, and impossible to ignore. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular." And the words came from a woman who did not need to raise her voice to command attention, standing just beyond the edge of the cleared space, her posture impeccable, her gaze fixed directly on the Duke, and Clara did not need to know her name to understand her position. This was someone accustomed to shaping outcomes, not observing them. And the Duke turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that the voice existed, and nothing more. And the woman stepped forward, not hesitating, her movement smooth, deliberate, as though the space that had opened was meant for her as much as it was for him. "The selection has been prepared with great care," she continued, her tone measured, each word placed with precision. "These arrangements were not made to accommodate disruptions." And as she spoke, her gaze flicked briefly toward Clara, not lingering, not needing to, because the dismissal was already understood, and Clara felt it land, not sharply, not as an insult thrown, but as a quiet statement of fact within a system that did not include her. And for a moment, the old instinct returned, the one that said, "Step back, lower your eyes. Let this pass over you as it always had." But the letter remained in the Duke's hand, and that changed everything, because it meant she could not simply disappear without leaving something unfinished behind. And the Duke did not answer immediately, not with words, not with explanation. He looked at the woman, held her gaze just long enough to register it, and then he moved, a small shift of his wrist, lifting the letter slightly, as if weighing it, as if considering its presence within this room, and then lowering it again. And the simplicity of that motion, the refusal to engage in the argument presented, carried more weight than any spoken reply could have. And the woman's expression did not change, not outwardly, but something in the stillness of her shoulders suggested that the expected response had not been given, and that absence was its own kind of answer. And she took another step forward, closing the distance further. "If there has been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice still even, still controlled, "it can be resolved without disrupting the proceedings." And the word proceedings lingered, carrying with it the implication of order, of structure, of a system that did not bend for anomalies. And Clara became aware again of how she must appear within that system, the wrong dress, the wrong place, the wrong moment. And yet she remained where she was, not because she felt entitled to it, but because something in the Duke's stillness held her there. And then, without warning, the lady in silver stepped back into the edge of the circle, her presence reasserting itself with a subtle shift, her chin lifted slightly. Her composure restored now that the moment had been reframed as something to be corrected. "Your Grace," she added, her tone softer but no less deliberate. "She is not among the candidates." And this time, the statement was direct, not framed as concern but as fact, and the Duke turned toward her fully, his attention narrowing, and for a second, the entire room seemed to sharpen with it, every movement slowing, every breath measured, and Clara felt the shift again, stronger now, the way power moves when it chooses a direction, and the Duke took a step forward, not toward the line of waiting women, not toward the woman who had spoken first, but toward Clara, closing the space that had separated them until the difference between them was no longer distance but presence. And he lifted the letter once more, not offering it, not returning it, but holding it at a height where it could be seen, where its existence within his control became undeniable. And then he spoke, his voice low, steady, cutting through the room without effort. "Then she will not stand with them." And the words landed, simple, precise, and for a fraction of a second, no one moved, because the meaning had not yet fully settled, and Clara felt it before she understood it. The beginning of something shifting, not complete, not resolved, but unmistakable, and the Duke's gaze remained on her, unwavering, as if the rest of the room had already been dismissed, and in that stillness, the balance of the evening tilted, just enough to be felt, just enough to make every person present aware that the order they had arrived with was no longer entirely their own. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room like a weight that no one could ignore, and for a moment, no one moved. Not the woman who had spoken, not the line of carefully chosen candidates, not even the servants at the edges of the ballroom who had learned long ago how to disappear into stillness, because what the Duke had said was not loud, not dramatic, but it had shifted something fundamental, and Clara felt it in the way the air changed around her, tighter, sharper, as though every eye in the room had recalibrated at once, no longer sliding past her, but fixing, measuring, reassessing. And she stood there, aware of the difference without understanding its full shape. Her hands empty now, the absence of the letter more present than its weight had ever been. And across from her, the woman who had first spoken did not retreat. She did not yield. She held her position with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been overruled in a room like this. And when she spoke again, her voice remained even, but there was something beneath it now, something firmer, something that pressed rather than suggested. "Your Grace," she said, taking another step forward, her skirts brushing softly against the marble. "This is not a matter of placement. It is a matter of propriety." And the word carried through the space, not as accusation but as structure, as the invisible framework that held evenings like this together. And Clara felt it land, felt the familiar edge of it, the reminder of where she stood within that structure, or rather, where she did not. And for a second, her fingers curled slightly at her sides, a reflex she had learned to hide, and the Duke did not look at the woman immediately. He remained facing Clara, his attention steady, as if the conversation unfolding around them existed on a different plane, one that did not require his participation until he chose it, and that choice, the absence of immediate response, stretched the moment further, pulled it thin until even the smallest movement felt significant, and then, slowly, he turned, not away from Clara, not fully, but enough to bring the woman into his line of sight, and when he spoke, his voice did not rise, it did not harden, it remained exactly as it had been, calm, precise, and entirely certain. "Propriety," he repeated, as though testing the word for weight, and then he took a step, not back, not aside, but forward, positioning himself between Clara and the rest of the room in a way that was not overtly protective and yet impossible to ignore, his presence creating a line that had not existed before, and the woman's gaze flicked briefly to that shift, just for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, something adjusted, something recalculated, because this was no longer a simple correction, this was something else, something that did not follow the expected pattern, and the lady in silver, who had first claimed the letter, shifted her stance again, her posture still composed but her certainty no longer untouched, and she glanced toward the others in the line, as if to confirm that the order they represented still held, and for the first time, Clara noticed the slight tension in those carefully arranged figures, the way their hands tightened around fans, the way their smiles did not quite settle back into place, because what had begun as a small disruption had now become something that touched them directly, something that threatened the structure they had been positioned within, and Clara felt the pressure of it, not as a force against her body, but as a weight of expectation pressing inward from every side, urging her to step back, to correct the imbalance simply by removing herself, and her breath caught, just slightly, as that instinct rose again, stronger this time, more insistent, and she shifted her weight, a small movement, barely visible, but enough that it might have been interpreted as retreat, and in that exact moment, the Duke moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a precision that intercepted the motion before it could complete, his hand lifting, not to touch her, not to restrain, but to occupy the space in front of her just enough to halt the step, and the gesture was minimal, almost imperceptible, and yet it stopped her completely, and Clara froze, her body caught between the movement she had begun and the stillness he imposed, and the room seemed to pause with her, every eye drawn to that small, controlled interruption, and the Duke lowered his hand again, just as calmly, as if nothing had happened. And then he spoke, not to the woman, not to the room, but to Clara, his voice quieter now, though no less clear. "Do not move," he said, and the words were not harsh, not commanding in tone, but they carried a weight that made them impossible to ignore, and Clara felt them settle into her, not as an order to be resisted, but as a certainty to be held, and she remained where she was, her breath steadying despite the tension that pressed against her from every direction, and the woman across from them drew in a slow breath, her composure still intact, but her control now challenged in a way that could not be easily dismissed. "You place her at the center of this room," she said, her voice still measured, but now edged with something sharper, something that acknowledged the shift even as it resisted it. "And you expect the rest of us to accept it without question." And the Duke turned his head slightly, just enough to regard her again, his expression unchanged, unreadable, and for a moment, he did not answer, not with words, not with gesture. He simply held that silence. And in that silence, the imbalance grew, stretched, until it could no longer be contained within the polite boundaries of the evening. And then he lifted the letter once more, the paper catching the light as it moved, and extended it, not toward the woman who had challenged him, but toward Clara, holding it at a height that required her to take it, to step into the space he had created, and everything seemed to slow, the motion of his hand, the narrowing of the distance, the breath in Clara's chest as she realized what that gesture meant, because to take it was not simply to reclaim what was hers, it was to accept the position he had placed her in, and for a second that stretched longer than it should have, she hesitated, her fingers hovering just short of the paper, the entire room watching, waiting, and then she moved, her hand lifting, closing around the edge of the letter, and as her fingers touched his glove, just briefly, just enough to register, the shift became undeniable, not complete, not resolved, but irreversible. The contact lasted less than a second, a brush of glove against skin, through the thin barrier of her own worn fabric, and yet it altered the balance of the room in a way no one could pretend not to notice, and Clara felt it as she closed her fingers around the letter, the paper steady now in her grasp, no longer slipping, no longer contested, but not yet hers in any ordinary sense, because the way she had taken it, the way he had offered it, had made it something else entirely, and she drew her hand back slowly, deliberately, as though any sudden motion might fracture the moment into something less controlled, and the Duke did not withdraw immediately, his hand remaining in place for a fraction longer than necessary, not touching, not restraining, but occupying the same space, and in that held position, the tension sharpened, stretched thin between them, and then he lowered his hand, just as precisely as he had raised it, and the absence of that presence was as noticeable as its arrival had been, and around them, the room shifted again, not outward, this time, but inward, attention narrowing, voices lowering, as if everyone present had leaned closer without moving, and Clara became aware of the weight of the letter in her hand, the faint crease along its edge where it had been pressed against the marble, the seal cracked just enough to suggest it had already been opened or nearly so, and instinctively, her thumb moved to steady it, to protect it, a small motion that did not go unnoticed, because nothing in that space was unnoticed now, and across from her, the woman who had spoken earlier watched this exchange with a stillness that was no longer neutral, her gaze sharper, more focused, as though recalculating not just Clara's presence, but the Duke's intention, and when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, but it carried further, cutting through the quiet with a clarity that demanded response. "You have made your position clear," she said, each word measured, "but you have not explained it," and the implication settled. Immediately, not as a challenge shouted, but as a structure asserted, because in this room, explanation was expected, justification was part of order, and the absence of it created a gap that could not be easily ignored, and Clara felt that gap widen, felt the eyes shift between her and the Duke, searching for meaning where none had yet been given, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire evening balanced on that unspoken question, and the Duke did not answer, not in the way they expected. He did not turn fully to face the woman, did not engage in the exchange she had initiated. Instead, he stepped forward again, closing the last small distance between himself and Clara, and the movement was simple, almost unremarkable, and yet it altered everything, because it placed him directly at her side, not across from her, not observing, but aligned, and Clara felt it immediately, the shift in perspective, the way the room now saw them not as separate points but as a single axis of attention, and her breath caught, just slightly, not from fear, not exactly, but from the sudden awareness of proximity, of scale, of the difference between them made more pronounced by its closeness, and she did not step back, not because she was unafraid, but because something in the way he had positioned himself made retreat feel like a misstep, like a break in a pattern she did not yet understand but was already part of, and the Duke turned his head slightly, not toward her, but toward the room, his gaze moving across the gathered faces with a calm that did not seek approval, and then he spoke, his voice even, controlled, and entirely unhurried. "There is nothing to explain," he said, and the words landed with a finality that did not invite further inquiry, and yet the silence that followed was not acceptance. It was resistance held in place by restraint, and Clara could feel it, the tension coiling beneath the surface, the unspoken objections pressing against the boundaries of propriety, and the lady in silver shifted again, her composure intact but her position no longer secure, and she took a small step forward, just enough to re-enter the edge of the space, her voice softer now, but edged with something more pointed. "Then perhaps we should proceed as intended," she said, her gaze moving briefly to the line of candidates, then back to the Duke, "and allow this interruption to be resolved quietly." And the suggestion was clear, a path offered, a return to order that required only a small concession, and Clara felt it as a pull, subtle but insistent, the promise that if she stepped back now, if she lowered her gaze and removed herself from the center of this moment, the room would reset, the tension would dissolve, and she would return to the edges where she had always existed, and for a second, her fingers tightened around the letter, the paper bending slightly under the pressure, and she shifted her weight again, not fully, not enough to move, but enough that the possibility of retreat reappeared, and in that exact moment, the Duke moved once more, not with his hand this time, not with a gesture that could be mistaken for coincidence, but with a step, a single, deliberate step that placed him half a pace in front of her, his shoulder aligning just enough to create a barrier that did not touch, and yet could not be crossed without acknowledgement, and the effect was immediate. The path that had been offered closed before it could be taken, and Clara froze again. The motion halted before it could complete, and the room felt it, the shift from suggestion to refusal, from possibility to decision, and the Duke did not look back at her, did not check if she would follow or remain. He simply stood there, occupying the space as though it had always been his. And then, without raising his voice, without altering his tone, he added, "We will proceed." And the emphasis was slight, almost imperceptible, but it redirected the meaning entirely, and the orchestra, which had been waiting in uncertain stillness, responded as though the signal had finally been given, bows lifting, strings catching, the first notes rising carefully, tentatively, as if testing whether the room would accept them, and Clara stood behind him, the letter held steady in her hand, the music returning around her, and nothing resolved, not the questions, not the tension, not the way every eye still found its way back to her. But the moment had moved forward, and she was no longer at the edge of it. The music did not return all at once. It slipped back into the room in careful measures, strings first, then the faint rise of a violin line that tried to restore what had been broken. But the rhythm was wrong, not in sound, but in feeling, because every note carried the awareness that something had shifted and could not be undone, and Clara felt it as she stood just behind the Duke, the space he had claimed still holding around them like an invisible boundary. And she realized with a quiet clarity that she was no longer standing where she had been before, not at the edge, not unnoticed, but at the center of something that had not yet settled, and her fingers tightened slightly around the letter, the paper warm now from her grip, the crease along its edge more pronounced, and she became aware of the way her breathing had changed, slower, controlled, as if she were matching the pace he had set without being told to. And in front of her, the Duke did not move immediately. He allowed the music to rise around them, allowed the room to attempt its return to order, and that stillness was not passive. It was deliberate, a pause that extended the tension rather than releasing it. And then, without turning, without looking back, he extended his hand slightly to the side, not reaching for her, not yet, but creating a space that suggested an action before it was taken, and Clara saw it, felt it, the intention held within that small motion, and for a second, she hesitated, because to respond would be to step further into the position he had created, and every instinct she had learned told her to resist that, to remain small, to remain unclaimed. But the room was watching, the pressure of it pressing in from every direction, and the absence of movement would be as visible as any misstep. And so she moved, her hand lifting slowly, deliberately, until it hovered just above his, not touching, not yet, the distance between them measured in inches, but weighted with something far greater. And the moment stretched, the music continuing around them as though nothing had changed, though everything had. And then her fingers lowered, resting lightly against his glove, and the contact was steady, not tentative, not forced, and for the briefest second, the entire room seemed to hold still. The motion of dancers paused mid-step, a turn half completed, a breath caught between notes, and then the Duke closed his hand around hers, not tightly, not possessively, but with a certainty that left no room for misinterpretation, and he turned, just enough to bring her fully into the line of sight of the room, and the effect was immediate, the attention that had been divided now converging, focusing, sharpening, and Clara felt it like a shift in gravity, the way the room now oriented itself around that single point, and the line of candidates, still arranged beneath the chandeliers, seemed to recede, not physically, but in importance, their presence no longer the center of the evening, and the lady who had spoken earlier did not step back. She remained where she was, her posture unchanged, but her gaze now fixed on their joined hands, and for a moment, the contrast was undeniable. What had been prepared against what had been chosen, though no one had yet spoken the word, and the Duke did not look at her. He did not acknowledge the tension directly. Instead, he stepped forward, drawing Clara with him into the open space that had been cleared, and the movement was smooth, controlled, as though it had always been intended, and Clara followed, not because she was led, but because the path had already been set, and as they moved, the dancers at the edges adjusted, creating space without needing instruction, their bodies shifting to accommodate a pattern that had not been rehearsed, and the music, uncertain only moments before, found its rhythm again, aligning with the motion unfolding at the center of the floor, and Clara became aware of the distance they covered, the measured steps, the way his hand guided without pulling, his presence defining the pace, and she matched it, step for step, her movements precise, controlled, as though she had been trained for this space even if she had not, and for a moment, the room seemed to forget its resistance, drawn instead into the shape of what was happening, the visual of it, the clarity of the motion, and then the Duke stopped, not at the edge of the floor, not near the line of candidates, but at the exact center, where the light from the chandeliers fell most directly. And he turned fully toward her, their hands still joined, and the music softened, not stopping, but lowering, as if making space for what might follow. And Clara lifted her gaze to meet his, not fully understanding what was expected, only knowing that this moment required something of her, something she had not yet named. And the room watched, every eye fixed, every breath measured, waiting for the next movement, the next word, the next shift that would define what this had become. And the Duke did not speak. Not yet. He simply held her there, at the center, in the light, in full view. And in that held stillness, the power of the moment settled, undeniable, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. The music lowered, not fading but tightening, the melody narrowing into something more precise, more deliberate, as though the entire orchestra understood that what was happening at the center of the ballroom was no longer part of the evening's design, but had become its axis. And Clara felt it in the way the sounds seemed to wrap around them, isolating rather than blending, every note marking time instead of filling it. And she stood there with her hand still in his, aware of the exact position, of every finger, the pressure of his grip, firm but not forceful, controlled in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And she realized, with a clarity that arrived too late to avoid, that there was no longer any version of this moment in which she stepped back unnoticed, because the room had already shifted too far, the line had already been crossed, and in front of her, the Duke held her gaze, not searching, not questioning, but steady, as if confirming something that did not require her permission. And then he moved, not away, not releasing her, but drawing her slightly closer, a subtle adjustment that aligned their positions more precisely within the center of the floor. And the motion was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried through the room like a signal, and Clara felt it immediately, the tightening of attention, the way every conversation stilled again, the way even the dancers at the edges slowed as if pulled into the gravity of that single shift. And her breath caught, just slightly, not from fear, not exactly, but from the realization that this was no longer an interruption. This was something being established, something that was taking form in front of everyone. And across the room, the woman who had spoken before did not remain silent this time. She stepped forward, not into the circle, not yet, but close enough that her presence pressed against its boundary, her voice cutting through the music with a clarity that did not need volume to carry. "Your Grace," she said, and this time there was no softness in it, no attempt to smooth the edges. "This is no longer a matter of discretion." And the words landed with weight, drawing the attention of every person present, because they named what everyone felt but had not yet spoken. And Clara felt the shift again, sharper now, the tension rising, tightening, as if the room itself were bracing for something that had not yet happened. And the Duke did not look away from her immediately. He held her there for a fraction longer, then released her hand, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with the same controlled precision he had used in every movement so far. And the absence of that contact was immediate, noticeable, like a line removed from a structure that had just been built. And Clara's hand lowered slightly, the letter still held within it, her fingers adjusting instinctively around the paper as if grounding herself in something tangible. And the Duke turned then, fully this time, to face the woman who had challenged him, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. And for a moment, the two of them held that line, not speaking, not moving, the space between them charged with something that did not need to be named. And then she stepped forward, crossing the boundary that had been drawn, her movement smooth, deliberate, her presence undeniable. "You bring her to the center," she continued, her voice steady but edged. "You place her where she does not belong, and you expect this room to follow without question." And the accusation, though framed in calm words, carried through the space with a force that could not be ignored. And Clara felt it land, felt the weight of it press against her, because it was not entirely untrue, not within the logic of the world they stood in. And for a moment, the old instinct surged again, stronger than before, the urge to step back, to remove herself from the line of conflict before it could close around her. And her foot shifted, just slightly, the beginning of a retreat she had not yet fully chosen. And everything seemed to slow, the motion of that step stretching into something suspended, and then the Duke moved, not toward the woman, not toward the line of candidates, but toward Clara, a single step that intercepted her movement before it could complete, and he did not touch her, not this time. He did not need to, his presence alone closing the space she had tried to create, and she froze, the step unfinished, her body caught between forward and back, and the room felt it. The interruption of motion, the refusal of retreat, and the Duke spoke, his voice low, even, cutting cleanly through the tension. "You are mistaken," he said, and the simplicity of the words carried more weight than any argument could have, and he turned slightly, just enough to include the room in what he was about to say next, his gaze moving across the gathered faces, not seeking approval, not acknowledging dissent, but marking the space as his to define, and then he added, "She is exactly where she belongs," and the words settled into the room like a final note that did not resolve, because they did not answer the question, they redefined it, and Clara felt it, the shift in meaning, the way the statement did not explain her presence but asserted it, and the effect was immediate, the murmurs that had been contained now rising, not loudly, but enough to be heard, enough to ripple through the edges of the room, and the line of candidates shifted again, their composure cracking in small, controlled ways, a glance exchanged, a fan lowered too. Quickly, a breath taken out of rhythm, and the woman in front of them held her ground, her expression still composed but no longer untouched, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire ballroom hovered on the edge of something, a breaking point that had not yet been reached, and Clara stood within it, the letter in her hand, the Duke at her side, and nothing resolved, not the tension, not the question, not the way every eye in the room now saw her differently, not as invisible, not as accepted, but as something that had disrupted the order in a way that could not be undone, and the music continued, steady, controlled, as if refusing to acknowledge that anything had changed, even as everything had. The words did not settle this time. They fractured, spreading through the ballroom in a low wave of disbelief that no amount of etiquette could fully contain, and Clara felt it hit her from every direction at once. The shift from quiet tension to something sharper, something closer to rupture, and for a moment, the music faltered again, not stopping, but slipping just enough to reveal the strain beneath it, and across the room. The line of candidates was no longer still, their composure breaking in controlled fragments, a step out of formation, a glance that lingered too long, a whisper that did not quite stay hidden, and the woman who had challenged the Duke did not move back this time. She stepped fully into the circle, crossing the last invisible boundary with a certainty that carried its own authority, and when she spoke again, her voice was no longer measured for politeness. It was precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. "Then say it plainly," she said, her gaze fixed on him, not on Clara, "because what you imply, your grace, will not remain contained to this room." And the statement hung there, heavy, because it named the consequence, the ripple that would move beyond this night, beyond this ballroom, into every conversation that mattered, and Clara felt it land in her chest, not as fear exactly, but as pressure, the understanding that whatever this was, it was no longer small, no longer something that could be undone by stepping away, and beside her. The Duke did not shift, did not retreat, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as it had been from the moment he entered the room, and for a second, he did not answer. He allowed the weight of the question to exist, to stretch, to press against the silence until it became something that demanded resolution. And then he moved, not toward the woman, not away from Clara, but forward, a single step that placed him fully between Clara and the center of the room, and he turned, not to face one person, but all of them, his gaze sweeping across the gathered guests, not lingering, not searching, but marking. And Clara felt the shift immediately, the way the focus widened, the way the moment expanded beyond the immediate conflict into something larger, something that included everyone present whether they wished it or not. And then he reached back, not looking, his hand finding Clara's again with an ease that suggested certainty rather than hesitation, and when his fingers closed around hers this time, the grip was firmer, not forceful, but definitive, and he drew her forward, not far, not dramatically, but enough to reposition her fully at his side, aligned with him rather than behind, and the motion was unmistakable, a declaration made through action rather than words, and the room reacted, not loudly, but visibly, a collective intake of breath, a stilling of movement, as if every person present had recognized the line that had just been drawn, and Clara felt it, the shift in how she stood, the difference between being placed and being aligned, and for a moment, the weight of it pressed against her, the awareness that she was now part of something that could not be easily undone, and her fingers tightened slightly in his, not pulling away, not resisting, but anchoring, and the woman in front of them watched this with a stillness that was no longer controlled, but contained, her composure holding by effort rather than ease, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not uncertainty, but recognition. "You would overturn an entire arrangement," she said, each word deliberate. "For a woman no one here knows." And the accusation was clear, not of impropriety alone, but of imbalance, of a system disrupted in a way that could not be justified within its own rules, and Clara felt it again, the old instinct rising, the urge to step back, to release his hand, to remove herself from the center of this conflict before it closed around her completely, and her fingers shifted, just slightly, the beginning of that motion, and everything slowed, the movement stretching into something suspended, and then the Duke tightened his hold, not sharply, not enough to draw attention as force, but enough to stop the motion before it could complete, and the interruption was immediate, absolute, and Clara froze, her breath catching as the moment locked into place, and the room felt it, the refusal of retreat, the denial of escape, and the Duke spoke, his voice low, controlled, cutting through the tension with a clarity that did not need volume. "That is precisely why," he said, and the words landed with a weight that shifted the meaning of everything that had come before, and he turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Clara, not fully, not breaking his alignment with the room, but acknowledging her within it, and in that brief glance, something passed that did not require explanation, and then he looked forward again, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, and he added, "Because none of you did." And the statement struck harder than any raised voice could have, because it did not accuse, it revealed, it reframed the entire room in a single line, and the effect was immediate, the murmurs that had been contained now breaking, not into chaos, but into something sharper, more fractured, as if the foundation beneath the evening had been shifted just enough to make every assumption unstable, and Clara stood within it, the letter still in her hand, the Duke at her side, and for the first time, the pressure that had been closing around her began to change, not lessening, but shifting direction, no longer pressing her out, but pulling the room inward, towards something that had not yet been resolved, and the music, which had struggled to hold its place, rose again, stronger this time, as if refusing to yield to the disruption, and yet every note carried the awareness that nothing in this room was as it had been before, and Clara felt it in the way she stood, in the way the eyes that had once dismissed her now lingered, not with acceptance, not yet, but with something closer to recognition, and the tension remained, sharp, unresolved, stretched to its limit, waiting for the moment when it would either break or transform into something else entirely. The words did not fade. They settled into something sharper, something that refused to dissolve back into the polite structure the room had been built on, and Clara felt it in the way the air shifted again, not outward this time, but inward, tightening around a point that could no longer be ignored, and her hand remained in his, the grip steady, unchanged, as though everything that had just been said had only reinforced what had already been decided. And for a moment, no one spoke, not the woman who had challenged him, not the line of candidates whose composure now held by effort rather than ease, not even the musicians who continued to play as if the sound itself might hold the room together. And then, without warning, the Duke released her hand, not abruptly, not with any sign of withdrawal, but with the same measured control that defined every movement he made, and the absence of that contact was immediate, noticeable, as though a line of tension had been cut and left vibrating in the air, and Clara's fingers tightened reflexively around the letter, the paper bending slightly beneath the pressure, and before she could adjust, before she could reorient herself within the space he had created, he moved, not away from her, not toward the woman who had spoken, but past her, a single step that shifted their positions entirely, placing her in the exact center of the cleared space while he stood just behind and to the side, no longer shielding her from the room, no longer intercepting its gaze. And the effect was immediate, the attention that had been divided now converging fully on her, and Clara felt it like a sudden drop, the weight of every eye pressing in, the absence of his presence at her side more pronounced than its existence had been, and for a fraction of a second, the instinct to step back surged again, stronger than before, because now there was nothing between her and the room, nothing to absorb the force of what was coming. And she stood there, the letter in her hand, her breath steady only by effort, and across from her, the woman who had challenged him took that opening without hesitation, stepping forward into the space he had vacated, her gaze now fixed directly on Clara, no longer addressing the Duke, no longer negotiating through him, but confronting the disruption at its source. "Then let her speak," she said, her voice clear, controlled, and carrying to every corner of the ballroom, and the words landed with precision, because they shifted the focus entirely from what the Duke had chosen to who Clara was, and Clara felt it immediately, the shift from object to subject, from being placed to being examined, and her fingers tightened again around the letter, the edges pressing into her palm, grounding her in something tangible as the room closed in, and the woman took another step, not aggressive, not hurried, but deliberate, closing the distance just enough to make the confrontation undeniable. "You stand where no one here expected you to stand," she continued, her tone measured but edged with something sharper. "So explain why." And the demand hung in the air, not shouted, not forced, but absolute in its expectation, and Clara felt the silence stretch around her, the music continuing but distant now, secondary, as though the entire room had shifted into a different rhythm, one that waited on her response. And for a moment, she did not move, did not speak, because the answer was not simple, not something that could be offered in a single line that would satisfy what was being asked. And behind her, she could feel the Duke, not touching, not intervening, but present, his silence as deliberate as his earlier actions, and that absence of intervention was its own kind of pressure, because it meant this moment belonged to her, whether she had chosen it or not, and her thumb moved against the letter, tracing the cracked seal, the slight tear where it had been handled too roughly. And then, slowly, she lifted it, not high, not dramatically, but enough that it could be seen, enough that its existence within this moment became part of the answer, and the room reacted, not loudly, but visibly, a shift of attention, a narrowing of focus, because the object that had begun this disruption was now being brought forward as something more than incidental, and Clara drew in a measured breath, her voice steady when it came, not raised, not forced, but clear enough to carry. "I was told to deliver this," she said, and the simplicity of the statement landed with an unexpected weight, because it did not justify her presence, it reframed it, and for a moment, the room held still, processing the shift, and the woman in front of her did not step back, did not concede, her gaze moving briefly to the letter, then back to Clara. "To whom?" she asked, and the question was immediate, precise, because it pressed further, demanded specificity, and Clara hesitated, not long, not enough to suggest uncertainty, but enough to acknowledge the weight of what she was about to say, and then she answered, her voice unchanged, "To him." And she turned, not fully, not dramatically, but just enough to indicate the Duke behind her, and the effect was immediate, the line of attention snapping back to him, the focus shifting again, and for the first time since he had stepped back, the room seemed to recalibrate around his presence, and the woman's expression changed, not visibly to all, but enough, a slight tightening, a recognition that this was no longer a question of intrusion alone, and the Duke moved then, stepping forward once more, not reclaiming his previous position, but altering it, standing beside Clara again, not in front, not behind, but aligned, and he reached for the letter, not taking it from her hand, but guiding it, his fingers closing over the edge of the paper as hers still held it, and the contact was brief, controlled, and then he took it, lifting it from her grasp with the same certainty he had shown before, and for a moment, he did not open it, did not examine it. He simply held it, the paper between his fingers, the seal already broken, and the Room watched, every eye fixed, every breath measured, waiting for what would follow. And then he unfolded it, not hurried, not dramatic, but precise, the motion clean, deliberate. And as the paper opened, the tension reached something close to its limit, stretched to a point where even the smallest movement felt significant, and Clara stood beside him, her hands now empty, the absence of the letter leaving her exposed in a way that was different from before. And he read, not quickly, not slowly, his gaze moving across the page with a focus that revealed nothing of what he saw. And for a moment, the room existed in that silence, suspended, waiting, and then he lowered the paper, just slightly, his expression unchanged, and looked up, not at the woman who had challenged him, not at the line of candidates, but at Clara. And in that glance, something shifted again, not outward, not yet, but enough to signal that whatever was written on that page had just altered the shape of everything that would come next. The glance did not linger, but it did not need to, because whatever had passed across the Duke's eyes in that single moment did not belong to uncertainty, and Clara felt it before she understood it. A shift so precise it did not ripple outward immediately. It settled inward, anchoring something that had already been set in motion, and he folded the letter once, not hurried, not careless, but with a deliberate exactness that drew every eye in the room to the movement and the sound of the paper. Creasing, soft as it was, carried through the silence like a marker, a point beyond which nothing would return to what it had been. And then he spoke, not loudly, not with emphasis, but with a clarity that cut through every remaining fragment of doubt. "It appears," he said, his gaze still on Clara, not shifting to the others, not addressing the room directly, "that the arrangements made this evening were incomplete." And the words landed with a precision that did not accuse, did not explain, but redefined the entire premise of the gathering, and Clara felt the meaning of it unfold in real time, the implications settling into the space around them. And across the room, the reaction was immediate, not in volume, but in texture, a tightening of posture, a stilling of hands, as if every person present had just realized that what they had assumed to be fixed had, in fact, never been fully secured. And the woman who had challenged him did not step back, but something in her stance shifted, not in retreat, but in recalculation, because this was no longer a question of propriety alone. It had moved into something more dangerous, something that touched on authority itself. And she spoke again, though this time there was a fraction of hesitation, barely visible, but present. "Your Grace," she said, her tone still controlled, but edged now with something sharper, something that pressed against the boundaries of the moment. "If there has been an oversight, it can be corrected without." And he interrupted her, not by raising his voice, not by cutting across her words, but by stepping forward, a single movement that shifted the entire axis of the room once again. And he extended the letter, not toward her, not toward anyone who might claim authority over the proceedings, but back toward Clara, holding it at a height that required her to take it, to complete the motion that had been left unfinished when he had taken it from her before. And everything slowed, the movement of his hand, the narrowing of the distance, the breath in Clara's chest as she realized what this meant, because this was not a return, not a dismissal, it was a placement, and her fingers lifted, not immediately, not without awareness, and when they closed around the paper, the contact was steady, deliberate, and the moment held, suspended between them, before he released it fully, and the absence of his hold did not diminish its weight. It increased it, because now it was entirely hers, and the Duke turned then, fully, not to Clara, not to the woman who had spoken, but to the room, his posture unchanged, his presence absolute. And for a moment, he did not speak. He allowed the silence to expand, to press against every corner of the ballroom until it could no longer be ignored. And then he said, "You prepared a selection." And the words were simple, almost neutral, but they carried through the space with a force that made them impossible to dismiss. And he paused, not long, but long enough to let the meaning settle. And then he added, "But you did not include the one who was already chosen." And the statement did not rise, did not sharpen, but it altered everything. And Clara felt it in the way the room reacted, not with a single motion, but with a collective shift, a recalibration of attention, of understanding, of position. and the line of candidates, still standing beneath the chandeliers, seemed to fracture further, their certainty unraveling in small, controlled ways, a hand lowering too quickly, a gaze dropping where it had once held steady, and the woman in front of them held her ground. But her composure was no longer untouched, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that suggested not just resistance, but recognition, and she spoke again, her voice still measured, but now carrying a different weight. "You speak as though this was decided before tonight," she said, and the question was not a challenge alone, it was an attempt to reframe, to contain what had just been said within a structure that could still be understood, and the Duke did not hesitate, did not soften. "It was," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer struck harder than anything else had, because it removed the possibility of improvisation, of impulse, of mistake, and Clara felt it, the ground beneath her shifting in a way that was both stabilizing and disorienting at once. Because this was no longer about being seen in a moment. This was about being known before she had even stepped into the room, and her breath caught, just slightly, as the realization settled, and the Duke moved again, not toward the woman, not away from Clara, but beside her, aligning himself once more at her side, not shielding, not leading, but placing himself in direct relation to her, and he reached out, not for her hand this time, but for the space just in front of her, his presence filling it in a way that made it clear that no one else would step there without acknowledgement. And the room felt it, the finality of the positioning, the way the power that had been contested throughout the evening had now settled into a form that could not be easily undone, and Clara stood within it, the letter in her hand, the weight of it no longer uncertain, but defined, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, charged with everything that had just been revealed, everything that had been shifted, everything that could no longer return to its previous state, and no one spoke, not immediately, because there was nothing left to question that had not already been answered, and the only thing that remained was what would come next. No one moved at first, not because they did not understand, but because they understood too well, and Clara felt it in the way the silence settled differently now, no longer sharp with resistance, but heavy with realization, the kind that does not break into noise immediately but lingers, pressing into every corner of the room until it reshapes the space itself. And she stood there with the letter in her hand, the paper no longer just an object but a confirmation, a proof of something that had already been decided long before she stepped through the doors, and her fingers relaxed slightly around it, not releasing, but no longer gripping as if it might be taken from her. And beside her, the Duke did not shift, his presence steady, no longer intercepting or redirecting, but established, and that difference mattered, because it meant the moment had moved from conflict into something else, something that did not require defense, and across the room, the woman who had challenged him remained where she was, but the tension in her posture had changed, not gone, not softened, but redirected inward, as though recalculating a position that no longer held the same certainty, and the line of candidates beneath the chandeliers was no longer aligned in the same way, their formation broken in small, visible ways, a step out of place, a hand lowered. The illusion of perfection undone not by force, but by the quiet shift of something more fundamental, and Clara felt the difference in how they looked at her now, not with dismissal, not with simple curiosity, but with something more complex, something that acknowledged her presence as part of the structure rather than outside it. And the realization moved through her slowly, not all at once, not in a way that could be easily named, but in the way her shoulders settled, the way her breath steadied without effort, and she did not step back, did not lower her gaze, because there was no longer a place for her to retreat to that would return things to what they had been, and the Duke turned his head slightly then, just enough to look at her fully, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow again, not in tension this time, but in focus, and his gaze was not questioning, not testing, it was certain, and he spoke, not to the room, not to the woman who had challenged him, but to Clara alone, his voice lower now, though it still carried. "You came to deliver something," he said, and the statement was simple, almost understated, and Clara nodded once, the motion small but clear, and he extended his hand, not to take the letter back, but to gesture toward the space around them, the ballroom, the gathered guests, the entire structure that had just shifted. "Then stay," he said. And the words were not a command, not an order imposed, but an invitation that carried its own weight, because it did not ask her to justify her presence. It assumed it. And for a second, the moment held there, suspended between what had been and what was now possible. And Clara felt it in the way her fingers adjusted around the letter, the way her posture aligned with the space she occupied. And she did not hesitate. Not this time. She did not look for permission beyond what had already been given. She simply remained where she was, her stance steady, her gaze level. And the room reacted, not with a single motion, but with a gradual shift, the kind that moves through people in waves, a turning of attention, a recalibration of position, and the orchestra, which had held its place carefully through the tension, allowed the music to rise again, fuller this time, more certain, as if it had found a new rhythm to follow, and the dancers at the edges resumed their movement, not fully, not without awareness, but enough to signal that the evening had not ended. It had changed, and Clara felt it as she stood in the center, no longer isolated, no longer out of place in the same way, but not entirely integrated either, because the tension had not vanished, it had settled into something quieter, something that would linger beyond this moment. And the Duke did not move away, did not step back into the role that had been prepared for him. He remained beside her, his presence aligned with hers, and the space they occupied held, not as an interruption, but as a new center. And across the room, the woman who had challenged him inclined her head slightly, not in full acceptance, not in concession, but in acknowledgement of a shift that could not be undone. And the line of candidates, once so carefully arranged, no longer held the same weight. Their presence diminished not by absence, but by comparison, and Clara stood within it all, the letter still in her hand, the meaning of it no longer uncertain. And though the tension had eased, it had not disappeared. It lingered in the glances that still returned to her, in the quiet conversations that would follow, in the understanding that what had been set in motion tonight would not end when the music stopped. And the moment held there, not fully resolved, but transformed, balanced between what had been and what would come next. The music no longer hesitated. It carried, full and steady, as if the ballroom itself had accepted the shift and chosen to move forward with it rather than resist. And Clara felt it in the way the rhythm settled beneath her feet, not unfamiliar anymore, not something she had to fight to keep up with, but something she could stand within without losing herself. And she did not move away from the center. She did not retreat into the edges that had once defined her place, because that space no longer existed in the same way. And beside her, the Duke remained exactly where he had placed himself, not drawing attention, not demanding it, but holding it with a quiet certainty that made everything else adjust around him. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be said to confirm what had already been made clear. And then he moved, not abruptly, not with any sign of urgency, but with that same controlled precision, his hand lifting once more, not to claim, not to command, but to offer. And it paused between them, open, steady, waiting, and Clara saw it, understood it, not as a test, not as a question, but as a continuation of what had already begun. And she did not hesitate this time, her hand rising to meet his, her fingers settling into his with a confidence that had not been there before. And the contact was firm, balanced, no longer uncertain. And for a second, the room seemed to narrow again, not in tension, but in focus, as if every eye recognized that this was no longer an interruption but a conclusion. And the Duke stepped forward, drawing her with him into motion, not a display, not a performance, but a simple, deliberate walk across the floor. And the dancers parted again, not out of confusion this time, but with an understanding that had already been established. And Clara moved with him, her steps aligned, her posture steady, the letter now held at her side, no longer the center of the moment, but still part of it, still a reminder of how this had begun. And as they crossed the space, the room followed, not physically, but in attention, every movement observed, every detail noted. And when they reached the far side of the ballroom, near the tall windows that overlooked the dark grounds beyond, he stopped, and the motion of the room slowed with him, not stopping entirely, but shifting into something quieter, something more contained. And he turned to her, fully this time, no longer angled toward the room, no longer dividing his attention. And for a moment, he simply looked at her, not as the room had looked, not measuring, not assessing, but seeing, and Clara felt it. The difference, the absence of judgment, the presence of certainty, and her breath steadied in response, her shoulders settling in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet entirely right. And the silence between them was not empty. It was full, holding everything that had just unfolded, everything that had shifted, everything that would follow. And then he spoke. His voice, lower now, meant only for her, though it carried just enough that those nearest might hear. "You were not meant to stand at the edge," he said. And the words were not dramatic, not declared for effect, but simple, grounded, and Clara felt them settle, not as a revelation, but as something she had known without knowing, something that had been waiting to be named. And her fingers tightened slightly in his, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of that recognition, and she did not look away, did not lower her gaze, because there was nothing left to hide. And behind them, the ballroom continued, the music rising and falling, the conversations returning in measured tones. But the center of it had shifted, not back to what it had been,